Hello and welcome to my second and final part in my CRJ tutorial series. Welcome also to the SimHanger. My name's Mark, the SimHanger, for all things flight sim related. We're en route from Farnborough to Jersey, and in part 1 I'll leave links to that video in the notes below. We covered from cold and dark up to cruise, and in this video we're going to start with cruise, go into the descent all the way down to a landing and final shutdown. So let's get started. This is a short 30-minute flight and we've been at cruise for a few minutes. But we'll soon be starting our standard terminal arrival for Jersey. It's the Jersey 1 Alpha arrival. We'll be switching from nav to heading mode once over the Jersey VOR. Then loop round as indicated for an ILS approach runway 26. Our cruise altitude is 18,000 feet and our speed is around 300 knots. And we can now start our preparations for descent. And firstly we'll set our landing altitude. We can bring up the information we need from the ECAS control panel by pressing the ECS button. I just popped this window out by pressing right alt and click, and the secondary display is showing us our pressures. We need to set our landing elevation. We can set the landing elevation by rotating the cabin pressure switch in the overhead panel. Jersey's at 280 feet, so let's set that. Cabin pressures are kept fairly constant. By setting the landing elevation allows the aircraft to depressurize gradually for the descent, for the comfort of the passengers. This is also a good time to set up our navs for our approach and landing. My nav 1 is Southampton, I don't need that anymore. Click to swap frequencies. Nav 1 is now Jersey, and setting the standby nav to the ILS approach runway 26, 110.3. Clicking here will swap the frequencies. The co-pilot's active nav is already set to the ILS approach as a standby in case nav 1 fails. Here's something I find quite useful. Hit the fix button on the CDU. Now I'll enter my destination, Echo Golf Juliet Juliet, and I'll paste it in here at the top. The general rule of thumb is begin your descent 3 times your altitude in thousands. We're at 18,000, so 18 times 3 is 54, and I input this into the CDU. Now if I just zoom out on the MFD so we can see more of our route, you'll see there is a green ring 54 nautical miles away from Jersey. This gives me a guide as to when I can start my descent. The CDU is already showing me a top of descent, pretty close to the green circle, so it looks about right. If I hit the MFD menu button on the CDU, the bottom left hand button will allow me to change the information displayed on our MFD display. I've changed it to VNAV and it's now showing VNAV information. I'm 27 nautical miles from Ortac, and from what we can see on the display, the descent will start around Ortac. On the CDU, if we hit the direct intercept or direct int button, it'll display essential descent information. It's showing me I need to be at 13,100 feet by angler, and I'd need to descend at 700 feet per minute if I started my descent now. But it's also showing maintain cruise altitude until Ortac, the beginning of the star. The descent rate will change and increase as we get closer to top of descent. Using the next page button we can see the desired altitudes for all of our intersection or waypoints. When we do hit our top of descent we'll get a visual indicator, a small snowflake on our horizon display and a blue circle in the descent indicator. If the little snowflake is above the horizon, we're too low and vice versa. Remember the CRJ is a manual descent. There's no automatic VNAV and no auto throttle. We're not far from our top of descent now. So it's time for me to set my desired altitude, and I'm setting that to 3,000. Overhead Jersey, as that's what's indicated on the chart. As I'm about to start my descent, I'm slowing down slightly, looking for around 280 knots to commence my descent. By pressing the direct intercept button, it's currently indicating a descent of 1700 to be at 13,100 by angler. This will increase to over 2000 by the time I hit top of descent. We're now at top of descent and we can see on the vertical indicator a descent rate of about 2000, and the snowflake is indicating as well. To initiate the descent, I click on the vertical speed button and then turn the dial until I reach the desired rate of descent, and this is indicated at the top of the PFD. My CDU is indicating 2,100 feet, and that's now set. The aircraft will now automatically gain speed, so I need to constantly be aware of my speed and adjusting my throttles as necessary to achieve the desired speed, which in this case is around 280 knots. I've almost immediately got a master caution indicating ice. So I'm going to put on both left and right hand cowl heaters. That seems to have done it. That's the western fringes of France. For my descent, the snowflake now is fairly centralized and I appear to be on track. I'm getting close to an altitude of 10,000 feet, so I'm starting to slow to 250 knots to comply with the speed restriction. My CDU is indicating that the ILS has been auto-tuned. Not long till we land in Jersey now, so I'm going to put the passenger signs on. So cabin crew can start clearing up, nearly at 10,000 feet, so the landing lights can come on as well at this point. Approaching 9,000 feet and roughly 12 minutes to go to landing in Jersey. I've changed my rate of descent to slow me down. Now shortly be switching to heading mode. The island of Jersey dead ahead. The barometer setting for Jersey today is the same as standard, 1013. The barometer setting on the PFD is flashing because we are below the transition altitude. So now to set the barometer for the pilot, the alternate, and also for the co-pilot. We're now prepping to move away from nav mode onto heading mode in preparation for our loop around the VOR. To select our current heading, we just press the center of the heading bug. Now slowing to clean speed, 210 knots. That's the warning sound that we're within 1,000 feet of our set altitude. Once over the VOR, we're going to turn on a heading of 126 degrees to loop round. Then back over the VOR for the ILS approach. Heading mode now engaged, and I'm going to change the nav source to the localizer, which will help me on my turn to line up with the ILS. We can see it's already indicating speed now just above 220 knots, and we're shortly due to capture our altitude of 3,000 feet. So far, so good. We're now well below the cloud cover, so the anti-icing can now come off safely, and we should shortly be capturing our altitude at 3,000 feet. That's it, captured. Now turning on a heading of 126 degrees. Continuing our turn so we can align with the ILS and slowing to 200 knots. First stage of flaps being set. And now for our final turn to line up with the ILS runway 26, aiming to head back and go directly over the Jersey VOR. Flaps to 8 degrees, speed 195 knots. Setting our V-speeds for landing is made easy with the EFB. Those are now set and fed into the computer. Now to continue our preparations for landing, reverse thrusters are armed, landing lights are on, cabin staff have been advised. We're 1 minute away from the Jersey VOR, prepping for our approach, and we should be at about 2,000 feet. Our localizer is already indicating, as is the glide slope. My nav source is now switched to localizer, and on the autopilot panel I'm going to switch over to approach. And the CRJ is automatically correcting, and I have the runway visual. As I've set my speeds, it's showing me the minimum speed is 132 knots. Speed below 180, I've got my gear down and flaps now to 20. The initial stages of the approach have brought me a little bit lower than I should be, but altitude seems to be holding and hopefully it will correct. I've set my minimum decision altitude to 820 feet, and it's at about that altitude that I'll take the autopilot off. Still going a little bit fast, so I'm going to bring in the next stage of flaps to 30 degrees. I'm keeping one eye on my speed at all times and manually adjusting my throttle to keep me just above or at the minimum recommended speed of 132 knots. If I get below that, she's going to get sloppy and I'm going to lose control sensitivity. She's captured the glide slope again. Flaps now all the way down 45 degrees, so we're back on track. Nose wheel steering armed for landing. One hand on the yoke and the other one on the throttle to maintain speed.
1000.
We've just dipped below 1000, so autopilot now coming off. Just past my minimum decision altitude, so landing I am a little bit low, just feeding in a little bit more power to keep the nose up. She keeps drifting to the right. I've got a bit of a crosswind. The glide slope is indicating I'm a little bit low, but it feels okay.
300.
Now letting the throttle settle, but keeping the power on. Quite a bit of rudder in, trying to keep the nose straight. But we're on track for a landing.
50, 40, 30.
As we come in, slight flare and let the speed bleed off.
10.
And we're down. Reverse thrusters engaged. Not a great landing, a little bit too far off center, but we're down safe and sound. Throttle back to idle and manual braking. Retracting the flaps as we leave the runway. We're just going to taxi to this holding point and then we're going to do a quick cockpit cleanup. Taxi lights can come on and our landing lights can go off. And our strobe light can go off as well. Let's now taxi to our parking, and whilst we do that, we must also put the APU on. First the power button to open the APU door, and then let's start the APU. Welcome to Echo Golf Juliet Juliet, Jersey. I think we'll take this first parking here. Most of the others seem to be taken or have a vehicle in, which is going to make parking a little difficult. I think we can stop here. This will be just fine. The shutdown procedure is fairly straightforward. Handbrake on, nose wheel steering can go off. And also we will disarm our reverse thrusters, 1 and 2. And it's time to cut the engines. We do this by lifting the locking lever and pulling the throttle back to fuel cutoff. That's engine 1 shut down. Now let's do engine 2. Lift the lever and pull the throttle all the way back. Our engines are now spooling down. Continuing with our shutdown, let's turn the transponder to standby and we turn both the navs to off. We're done here. Now to the overhead panel. Taxi lights go to off. I should have done that a little bit earlier as I pulled into the parking. If you're doing a turnaround, you'll probably leave your logo lights on, otherwise you would switch them off. The beacon light comes off. We'll leave the nav light on while there's somebody on board. Both pilot and co-pilot windshield heats can now go off. We're no longer relying on our instrumentation, so both of the probes can be switched off as well. The engines have now completely spooled down, so left and right booster pumps can come off. Our cabin signs can now come off. It's time for the passengers to deboard. Time to head back to the EFB and we can open the doors and the storage compartments so that they can take the luggage. Before we do a final shutdown, there's something worth knowing. You can refuel the CRJ from this panel. Flip the switch guard up and turn the switch on. And if we go across to the right hand side to the defuel and refueling panel and turn that on, we can then increase and decrease fuel. So I'm now increasing the fuel required and we can see both left and right tanks are now receiving fuel. The same thing happens if I decrease the fuel quantity. I'm taking fuel out of the tanks and the amount available is decreasing accordingly. It's a really nice feature, especially if you're doing a quick turnaround. Once you've finished refueling, you can just switch it off and you're done. And now for the final part where we're going to completely shut down. Our hydraulics 1 through 4 can come off. Our emergency lights also go off at this point. And as we're leaving the aircraft, the nav lights can come off as well. That's just about everything shut down, so we no longer need power to the aircraft, so we can go ahead and turn off the APU and close the APU door. As we lose power to the aircraft, the air packs show a fault, which is not a problem. Just turn the recirculation fan off. And lastly, our battery master goes off. And that's it, we're done. Close the doors and head on home. And we're down and shut down in Jersey. And that brings us to the conclusion of our second video. And I hope these 2 videos have provided you with enough information to get you started on the CRJ. It's definitely worth a look, and there are a number of other features available with this aircraft that we haven't had time to cover today. Are you flying the CRJ? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for joining me today. Take care, look after yourselves, and as always, bye for now.